Hello, Disability Lecture. Welcome back. I told you last week that this week we were doing 2 guest speakers, and those were the readings you did last week, the 2 from Shane and the 2 from Aaron. So this video is the revered Dr. Shane Neilson, who you can see below, in his wonderful hair and his double-decker coffee. And
my hair.
I love it. We had a short introduction from him last week, and I'll just reiterate that Dr. Neilson's from McMaster. He has the dual MD PhD, and the PhD was in English literature, which was why there was a lot of literary questions if you chose to do Shane's material. And is there anything else you would like to add that wasn't in the context last week, Shane?
No.
No, he's a great guy. I'll add that. How about that? So he's going to do a short lecture on his own material and the ways in which his lived experiences inform what he does and says. And then we're going to go back to the questions that you sent to us that he's going to take a stab at for us. And we're not going to get to every question, guys, but we'll pick a couple, okay? And then we'll see what happens. Sounds good? For you. Sounds good to Shane.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds awesome.
I thought you were actually talking to people there.
No, I have to speak to myself and then hope that they listen to me.
I was convinced.
Thank you. My method acting, it works. All right, so Shane, it's all you. I will mute.
Next. Yeah, when it comes to audience satisfaction, I'm all about answering the questions. So let's see if we can ring it and go all the way through or something.
I love it.
Anyway, talk today. Title. And I gotta preface what I'm gonna say by saying that I don't have any slides. I just don't want to inflict those upon you, and you don't need them. Actually, I find them visually distracting, and I can't look at the screen myself. So one of the things you're going to notice is I'm actually not looking at the camera very well when I'm speaking. When I'm looking at Sarah, I'm going to be looking at the camera pretty good. But when I'm looking at teacher, I'll be square. But when I'm actually talking to you, I'll be looking all over the place.
No slides, just vibes.
Slides are not for me. As you can see, they're short because I can never look at them. Anyway, so here's the structure at the top. There's going to be a lived experience positionality bit at the start that I'm going to share with you. It's not going to be overly long or detailed, but it'll give you the coordinates, many of which I think you already are aware of based on the readings that Sarah provided you. I'm going to, the reason why I'm doing that is, core disability practice, right? I'm going to share that as it relates to what I refer to as the broad sketch. The broad sketch of political philosophy in terms of Canadian healthcare and disabled people. So I titled the first part of my broad sketch as follows. It's the brief history of how Canadian healthcare and infrastructure grew, part 1. It's the pre-neoliberalism part, which I have real trouble getting my mouth around. And then the second part, part 2, of a brief history of how Canadian healthcare infrastructure grew, is called system contraction, a neoliberal term. I'd say that there are probably 4 stages to the Canadian healthcare system. One being pre-contact, of course, and those traditions continually running but disrupted. So healthcare systems provided to Indigenous people by other Indigenous people. And then, of course, settler contact, disrupted, but they were maintained nevertheless, despite it, and in contrast and parallel with it. And then there were pre-socialized systems of care with charity-based church care. I'm not talking about those. Specifically focusing on welfare state care and neoliberal care. So the latter 2 of the things. Then I'm going to try and briefly talk about how disabled people fit into socialized systems of care. And then I'm going to talk to you about the unwritten policy when it comes to Canadian healthcare and why it exists. And I'm going to tell you why it's especially bad for disabled people, that unwritten policy. So in terms of the idiosyncratic language that I use, I have the broad sketch, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is welfare state care. Part 2 is neoliberal deterrence care, and then I have the unwritten policy, which is a thing that really, really frustrates me as it operates in Canadian society. It's unwritten policy that's bad for disabled people, mad people, non-neurotypical people, sick people, deaf people, people who cannot see, the unsighted. All right, so here's my lived experience positionality. This is me. I always get a little strange, feel a little strange talking about this because, it's never only such, but I do think that the identity coordinates are politically useful and certainly in the short form, insightful, but it's not the whole thing. So I was born non-neurotypical. I was born autistic to a non-neurotypical met family in rural New Brunswick. And that's important to hear as these internet waves are being to you, presumably Ontario-ishness people. Because my access to socialized care, I was born in 1975, so my access to socialized care is compromised in 3 ways, probably more. There are lots of different ways to think about how broken the system was back then and now, but there are 3 big ways. The first is my inability to advocate for myself. It's still ongoing alexia, but anyway, you never guess it here in front of the screen, but put me in front of people. So my inability to advocate for myself, my father's indifference to do so. He was also similarly affected, but also mad. So his ability to really be an advocate for the family in a constructive way was quite curtailed. He could advocate in a destructive way, but that's a whole other story. And also about my location and nation, right? So I come from the east coast of Canada, and if you go visit a hospital, still to this day over there, you're going to see a distinct difference between the hospitals in Ontario. You go to Toronto, and you go to Fredericton, New Brunswick, or you go even to Halifax, the tertiary care center in the region. No comparison at all. Even in the architecture, you can see this. Even at the level of cleanliness, you can see this. So I become a medical student, which is interesting. And while I'm a medical student, the pre-existing strangeness of being non-neurotypical gets intensified, let's say, by me becoming, me developing bipolar disorder, becoming whatever, it was always there, I assume. But I became bipolar, and that became active. Good old bipolar 1, for those who didn't know. I get nice and wild. So I'm treated in a stigmatized way by other learners and staff. Because of the pre-existing non-neurotypicality, right, that was always there. It was always the beginning strangeness. But the madness puts an exponent on that. And what happens is I'm deemed bad. Put that in quotation marks. I'm deemed bad by the norm. And I'm doubly pathologized because I exist within the diagnostic machine. So you're not allowed to be sick. You're also not allowed to be bad in that particular professional sphere. You're policed heavily because you're going to enter those realms of, wanted eliteness of physicianhood, and far be it for us to ever admit any sort of filth out to the world as a practicing physician. It's bad representative of us. I don't know where they really got that logic, but anyway. So I exist within the locality of diagnostic power. My diagnosis becomes, in a way, bad. It's not an actual thing, right? Just bad problem. And my identity, in consequence, because this is the social life I'm living, despised, is also bad. My identity is as bad. And I still have to look back on that experience and say, but wasn't I supposed to be in a place that was compassionate? The place where care was supposed to sprout? No. And I don't mean to look back and say it was all bad. I'm not doing the same thing back. I'm just talking to you the general look of it. There were some bright spots, but I don't need to sing those in order to make People who are uncomfortable with this experience feel better for themselves. You know, it's an easily saleable argument. So are you saying, you know, everything's all bad? No, not. But it was pretty uncomfortable for the reasons I stated. You can just run that old thought experiment in your head about what it'd be like for a student today. So I had some colorful adventures as a madman. I ended up getting swallowed by one of organized medicine's institutions via inpatient lockdown. They took my shoes, which I still resent to this day. I still hate the fact that they took my shoes. I know why they took them. I still don't think it was nice. And I emerged in Ontario after about 6 months of inpatient admission. And after having been made significantly sick by contraindicated pharmacological treatment. So I got placed on drugs that really made me unwell. I say I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but that came much later, so the drugs that they actually gave me to treat what they thought was only depression really made what was quite unwell, especially unwell. So I got sicker and sicker every day I was in there, which you can imagine I began to figure out. Anyway, I struggled to be properly understood by medicine due to the pre-existing non-typicality, right? So you enter the institution to get diagnosed because you want to die, but you're already on the spectrum, and whatever they've got in order to properly identify what you have is probably not going to work, because they're starting from within the norm, you know, deciding what's abnormal and normal, and then something comes along that they really especially don't understand and wish it wouldn't exist. There are no real care systems available for adults with what I have. Not very comprehensive anyway. So, you know, they don't understand me. They give me the wrong drugs. I get sicker, and I languish because they can't actually identify the thing that I truly have. You know, it's a common story. The labels change, but the problem remains the same. Me, bad. You know. They actually ask. I've gotten my old notes from the hospital. I've grown up enough in the world to be able to do that. I don't recommend that to people early on, but I grew up in the world enough to know, you know, I really remember them thinking I was bad. I carried this around. So, you know, in the hospital, they thought I was bad. So I got the notes, I asked for them, and indeed they did think I was bad. Strange, huh? That I was able to tell. All written all through those charts were things like cluster B traits and borderline personality and things like that. But I got to tell you, I was sick as they come and wanted to die. But bad, you know. Yeah, I'll share you some of the details, but really close to death. But yet still, after those series of experiences through the charts, still that pathologizing language, which exists everywhere all the time, right? So I'm not an isolated experience in that regard. Anyway, something doesn't seem complete. The puzzle seems to be missing half its pieces. Here's a terrible kind of madness movie metaphor. Right now, you know, the piano keys just aren't quite in this movie soundtrack. It's not sounding completely melodious. There's some strange notes happening. So how to make sense for me? How to make sense for me and for them of a life of profound but preferred isolation, of not really understanding what other people are doing or why they're doing it. Really slow to figure that out. Of limited friendships and very impaired sociality as a young person, with sensory oddities that no one ever asked me about. No one ever wanted to know these things. They just wanted to know about mood, you know, because they don't think about this sort of thing. It's not something they really want to deal with. Quasi-voluntary hand motions, my hands will constantly move unless I focus on it, and if I focus on it, I can stop it, because of course, you know, I can stop it, so it shouldn't happen. It's bad, but I can't stop it all the time. It's, you know, it starts to, you know. So I eventually seek care outside the healthcare system. By this point, I get recognized as having bipolar disorder, and I get put on drugs, and here's maybe where a happy note for the medical system comes in. There's a win. I get put eventually on the right drugs, and I get the right diagnosis, and I become a lot better. All bad. They figured it out. But, you know, it took me being floridly manic in front of them one day before they actually figured it out. It wasn't hard to tell, but you had to let go of the word bad, maybe. You had to care a little bit before you bothered. I lucked out, I guess. I found people that cared eventually. But there are many less privileged than I in that regard. And hereby I firmly acknowledge maleness and whiteness, but especially physicianness, because they cost a lot of money for them just to kind of throw away. So they invested in me in that way towards the end. Anyway, I sought care outside the medical system because medicine doesn't want to deal with ASD or ADHD as an adult. They'll deal with it, you know, when you're a kid in the pediatric room. Sorta, somewhat, not bad, I guess, not terrible, but it's definitely not something as an adult. The question begins, why do you get diagnosed as a kid? It's your fault that we didn't care enough to care, you know. You got to spend several $1,000s to get the official ticket so that you can get acknowledged as having this or that or get treated for it. You know the sort. I won't go through that. I wrote about the medicalization of society, the psychiatrist claim, that sort of thing. So ASD is eventually provided as formal diagnosis. But the difference with this one is that it was one sought by me, and it was to understand the whole life history that it preceded. So I began to know who I. It made sense. It made so much sense in that which couldn't be explained simply by mood disorder. So much. Here's another key part of the talk that's about to come. So not only do I have significant experience in the medical system as a result of living, literally, not only working with it, but living in it for over half a year. I mean, by the formal definition, I wasn't institutionalized, right? So living within it, working within it. One of my son actually became unwell as well, so I have an experience as a parent. So he became ill at 2.5 with an extremely rare form of disability. We're interesting out there in New Brunswick, so we've got bipolar disorder running through the family, we've got ASD running through the family, and we have a very, very odd form of epilepsy running through the family. But we didn't know, until my son came along. All that epilepsy up to his point, which is generally described, people were put on drugs, but my son had a very, very interesting kind. He actually does so poorly that he regresses developmentally. And it was preventable. It's because of misdiagnosis by an uncaring doctor that my son's brain is doomed to, I don't know what the word is. I don't mean to be biomedical or anything, melt. Okay. I mean, it's terrible what happened. Yeah. So, he's now intellectually disabled. And the only silver lining I can take from this experience is that I see how the world treated people like me when I was small by watching my son, right? How the world interacts with him. And I also finally understand a bit better what it was like to be my father, which up to this point had been completely impossible to really comprehend. But now that I'm in different shoes, but shoes that, shoes maybe that are oriented a bit more towards my family's welfare, but nevertheless, looking upon this not similarly afflicted, I get a better sense of it, and once again, can't walk away just saying, all bad, just bad, all bad. Not all bad. So I guess I could say I witnessed how badly, I'll use that word, socialized medicine fails psychiatrically unwell children and medically unwell children. The both of them. I see how the Q of our system is justified as the cost we all bear for our care, but we don't bear the same. To save my son's brain, because I was dealing with this neurologist who didn't care, I sought care in the U.S. Unfortunately, that came too late. But the American system was there to take my money, so that my son could properly get the care he required. And that story is a story I tell in another book that's coming out in about a year or two with the University of Regina Press. again, the American system, all bad, right? Don't care about people. People suffer. Lives aren't safe. But you know what? If it hadn't have been there, my son wouldn't have got an MRI of his brain that he desperately needed. And then I think, what would have happened if somebody without means, was in the same situation and didn't have the money with which to be able to travel to Buffalo to get that MRI? Yeah. Okay, time for the broad sketch. So that's my lived experience, everybody. Really, really happy news. But it's been a pretty thorough engagement on all fronts of this system. As a patient, as a physician who gets to see its inadequacies and limitations every day, and also its successes. I wouldn't do it if there weren't some good to be done. But largely, it's vanquishing the dragon of uncaringness out there, all in the name of resources. Rationing. So now for part one of the broad sketch, socialized care. The larger political philosophy that influences what I'm talking about in terms of my lived experience is the broad sketch. So I know that some of you out there held policy, not all, and in the case of individuals who know well and intimately what I'm about to describe, I apologize, but I still think that my big broad sketching in the context or when linked to that lived experience is nevertheless a useful thing to hear, because policy books are policy books. I've read them too. I also want to say I don't mean to lecture you about anything you don't already know, in a sense, because I respect the value of training. There is a benefit to it, and I recognize that as a practicing doctor. But I want to conclude this little preface of the broad sketch by saying that it is one that if I'm not a true health policy credentialed individual, and one who's lived it, so to speak, that's fair. And it's also one quite informed by epistemology and more than passing familiarity with political philosophy. And it also had the benefit of having read every word of the Hall Report, the Marsh Report, and the rash of what I call those oblivious and ridiculous Medicare checkups, the pantomime is what I call those things. The pretending to do better when the conditions are completely set against the said doing it better. Normies doing the norms so that they can all feel good and sleep together at night with a lie, which I'll talk to you about. About the lie. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracist right-wing broadcast or anything, but there is a lie out there, everybody. Yeah. Okay, so once upon a time, here's the broad sketch, we had a social welfare state. We really did. We're still there. I wouldn't even call it remnants. It's still there, but it's, oh wow, it's been hollowed out. But anyway, once upon a time, we had a social welfare state. And we copied the UK. That's really who we copied. We were Anglo-British, back in the whenevers, the early 1900s. That's primarily the way things were, blah, blah. And we copied many of the UK's social welfare policies that preceded ours. We were late to their adoption. So those included programs for the poor, the unemployed, for education, and the like. And the nature and scope of those programs increased over time. And for those out there who are not health policy people, did you know the healthcare fell under the Canadian Department of Agriculture up until about 1919? Because it did. Yeah. Anyway. So the ideas that are driving that debate, the debate around the development of the social welfare state are eminently debatable. It all depends on where you fall on your political spectrometer. You could claim that the programs were created because of a sense of social responsibility. That's certainly where I fall. Let's care for one another, and let's care for one another, especially if we have the most means. But you could also argue that it's purely pragmatic capital, taking care of capital, because it's under threat if there's a large and angry disenfranchised group or groups. So the development of care, I'm skipping over a lot, but the development of care in Canada is quite complicated. That social welfare system that I'm talking about occurred coincident with a whole bunch of local improvised solutions to the problem of care in Canada, where infrastructure was poor. The very first plan that was created to provide health insurance, that was worker-based. That was something that was provided by the mines, but kind of advocated for by the workers themselves. In Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, in a mine, coal mine. And you begin to see like little improvised plans for healthcare popping up all around that time. In the 1930s, I think, is when that started. In the mid-1930s, I think, but anyway, somewhere around there, you started to get these little insurance plans. And then it became a big thing in the prairies, but also in BC, in Alberta, in the mountainous parts. So, it became kind of this big groundswell initiative. I saw a cat go by. That's the famous cat. Yes, that's a different cat. That's not the
Yes, this is Domino, one. Here to visit. Thank you, Domino. So sorry.
I love the cat. So a whole bunch of these little health insurance kind of schemes developed, and they were all based in small little tiny enterprises or communities that said, hey, we need to take care of one another here. Here's how we have invented a way to do it. It requires money, and we're going to take care of one another in this town. And we're going to do it based on property tax rates, or people are going to pay a basic rate themselves, or there's going to be some sort of workplace tax, some kind of that. But it was very, very small and local, and you could manage it based on the people that were there who saw you, sort of thing. Right? Very community-based, you could say. That quickly grew, especially in good old Tommy Douglas's Saskatchewan. So the myth that we meant ourselves is that Tommy Douglas is the so-called father of Canadian healthcare, and that's just not true at all. The father of Canadian healthcare doesn't exist. It was a whole bunch of people who decided that they needed to take care of themselves in order to be well in this world. You know, that's how it started, and of course that's how it started. And it started on the principle of charitable care, right? So the model was already there. It just wasn't a great model, and we improvised and built a different one. But it grew, and this particular, you know, I'm not knocking Tommy. He made something pretty cool, and it spread like wildfire across the nation. The federal government stole it in order to, you know, get votes, etc. But you could see, as this was building, what am I talking about in terms of timeline? So in 1947, HIDS came along, the Hospital Insurance and Diagnostic Services Act. That was when the federal government came on the scene and took Tommy's idea and spread it across Canada at a federal level. All the provinces eventually signed on to that. We saw that was a good deal. And then in 1956, I think, or something like that, the Medical Care Act came alive. These are all dates, and I'm quoting them off the top of my head, but I'm kind of sketching for you these humongous. Like the general gist here is, wow, look at these massive programs that were being created that were tremendously expensive, and were all designed to help people. I mean, where are they now? You know, where are these programs now? The horizon was always over there, and it was there, and we're moving towards it. And I don't think that's a naive thing to say, and I don't think it's a romantic thing to say. Like, there were constantly new programs being built. You could look at it the other way and say, well, they had to build those programs because they weren't there. It's a lack of them that required the necessity of them. But I say it's the trajectory that matters. I say it's the trajectory that matters. It's the heading towards. It's not the kind of hollowing out that we've got now. Okay, let me tell you, though, some of the famous math that underpins that HIDS Act, that Hospital Insurance Diagnostic Services Act of my mindset in 1947. Here it is. The Feds fund 50% of the cost of province or territorial insurance plans for hospital diagnostic services, as long as political commitment is signaled that the so-called 4 principles of socialized medicine are preserved. You've probably heard of those. But the bottom line is, the Feds pay half a dollar for every dollar the province spends. You can imagine what would happen. You know, it was a spending spree. Let's build this here and do that there. And maybe that wasn't the greatest expenditure of money, but that was the principle. 50%, a half and half, and it resulted in the creation of a lot of infrastructure. Those 4 principles that I mentioned, I really don't. I really find it triggering to the point of triggering. I really do. Because I feel like these are the things that the virtuous tell one another at night to fall asleep. It's not that way. It hasn't been that way, I don't think, ever. And it will never be that way, the way we're headed now. So these 4 principles I'm not even going to name. You know, I'm not even going to say them out loud. Because I think they're lies. Based on, you know, the life that I live is out in New Brunswick and weird. Okay. The lie, though, I bring it up. I'll just quickly mention it. It's something that we don't tell each other about at night, so that we can sleep, as we suspect and will soon be confirmed that there will be no care for us tomorrow. Only a weight, or an incompetent practitioner, or a lack of care for our needs. We can't actually tell the truth to one another, because if we did, it'd be pretty scary. And a lie costs no money. Anyway, feds are on the hook for every half buck the province wants to spend when it comes to healthcare. That creates an incredible spending binge in which institutions proliferate at an exponential rate, which is not a terrible thing in a land lacking care capacity. Though it also wasn't, to use the terminology of the Eric comment, oh, are we about to pivot? It wasn't terribly efficient. Hey, it wasn't efficient at all. It was good, though. In essence, we have an increasing national sense, an expansive federal sponsoring role, and an increase in care capacity for citizens, especially as the Medical Care Act really came consolidated in the 60s, which picked up the slack of the other hospital care that wasn't provided for by the Act. And again, no romanticization from shame, because what was left out of the Act that we're still waiting for now? Well, things like comprehensive dental care, pharmacare, things like that, they're still not there, and they may never come. Okay. Now, back in those old days of the social welfare state, there were problems with that system. Care was still inadequate. Access was still poor, especially disabled people. Trajectory was the thing, though, as I mentioned. The horizon was always one of care. Somewhere off in the distance was the promised land, and we were heading there, and we could prove that. Well, look what we built, look what we did, look what we're doing. Okay, here's part 2 of the broad sketch, and make the terrible, villain sound, dun-dun-dun, sort of thing. Enter neoliberalism. So in the 1980s, as I'm sure many in the class are aware, probably everybody, I'm sorry to bore you, a change occurred in the neoliberalization of money markets and deregulation of capital controls, resulted in a host of changes in financial systems, which in turn had cultural effects, and emphasize that, had cultural effects, and wide-ranging policy effects in other areas. In other words, we got infected with this way of thinking that said we got to save money, because we don't have any money. Money, money, money. Care got lost in this game. It all came down to money and bean counting, and providing the most efficiency. And when you think that way, and you don't think enough about the other thing, that care, the reason why it's there to help someone else, well, you get what we get now. So we began to live life differently, and our cultural reference changed. Wendy Hall has written a lot about that. But in terms of healthcare, what was once a growth industry became a managed denudation, a projection of symbolic care, while the actual kind was quite compromised. Administrators to the system justified their existence while searching for efficiencies. Oh, it just sets my teeth on edge. They're searching for efficiency. Who talks that way? They do. That themselves were part of neoliberal rhetoric. So these are like the bar bouncers of policemen. This is not the FBI. This is like where it's enforced on the corner. These are the security guards sort of thing, right? It's everywhere. They're the little police. So the growth of hospitals slowed quite a lot. I witnessed that as a child. I was coming of age where things started to slow down, in the 80s, but especially in the late 90s, it really started to slow down in Canada. And indeed, there was a net loss of hospitals as rural hospitals amalgamated according to the logic, according to efficiencies, into more central hospitals in larger areas. I'm very well aware of the arguments that support these things, and I don't look upon this as capital BAD. I'm talking about a general systemic change that has some consequences. And, you know, in with the good also comes some of that BAD. So, that was a key tenet in neoliberalism, trying to offer the most cost-efficient care to most people, Cat's head sticking out of the box. I'm very excited to see what happens next. It's going to... No, stop looking at me. Yeah, most efficient care for the most people. There's a term from individual people benefiting. I look upon this as a sense. This is my feeling of reading many things. But there's a term from individual people benefiting, which is a social welfare orientation, to a systems perspective. It's the system that will benefit individual people. It's a change in emphasis. Yeah. Okay. Before I'm sure any of you were born, in the Chrétien era of the 90s, the offloading of federal responsibilities on the provincial government in terms of reduced cash transfers was awesome. So in my little complaint here about neoliberalism, like, there was a huge financial problem. The federal government solved it by saying, "Ha, provinces, you solved it." And the provinces said, "Ha, municipalities, you solved it." And in the end, no one could solve that. You know, it was just a complete offloading of responsibility, and the answer was that less was able to be given. You know, and the reason behind all of this thinking and logic and the consequences for us finding ourselves in that spot was itself neoliberalism, which is another sidebar topic. I'm getting distracted, you know, but that's the story. So whatever the flow, though, what I deem the lie, that thing I mentioned before, became operative, and it's a lie the neoliberal era depends upon for its supposed efficiency. So what can be more efficient than a lie? Or expedient, anyway, after all. Lies cost nothing at the time they're told, and so long as they're believed. The number of metrics that show how poorly Canada's performing at the provision of care as compared to how much is spent is truly massive. Okay? How much we spend compared to how much we get is truly a frightening graphic, of which there are many on the internet, but not on my slides. They're easily available and reported on in the media. And this talk isn't about proving that, because that's already proven. There's only one system that spends more in the world and gets less results, and guess which one that is? That's the American system. And then our peculiar situation gets very much stranger. So this talks about the lie. It's the lie that we must confront and speak honestly with one another about. It's the lie that depends on the American neoliberal beast. Okay? We require this big bad guy below us so that we can contrast our own nicer neoliberal beast so that we can reassure ourselves how much more compassionate we are. We have a system. It provides care. It's not the American system. And then you set the tune for the rest of your life. That really is how things have gone for the past, I don't know how many years, and will continue to, unless we change it. So anyway, here's the lie unpacked. We have an adequate system. I don't think that's true. But we have an adequate system as part of the lie. We have an adequate system, and it's there for us if we get sick. So we have a system. That's true. It's there for us when we get sick. Nominally true, but true. Let's say, okay, fine. I can believe this far. Also, we get sick. So that's true. Right? But unless the illness is one that can be cured, such as surgically intervened upon or an infectious illness, then care needs are likely to be chronic, right? And of course, in that formulation, let's get past access to care, which is still a problem, getting the proper diagnosis and treatment, which is another problem I just skipped in here, which was we get sick, there's a symptom, it's there for us. But even at that most find and cure model that I mentioned, the system falls down, right? In terms of my son. So even at the most, let's find something to prevent the absolute worst outcome happening to someone who's going to be dependent, so-called in quotation marks, upon society, quotation marks for the rest of life. It's still not great. Anyway, the lie is that there's a system that is there for us if we get ill, that it will recognize our illnesses, But the truth is, most of the things that we suffer from are chronic illnesses, and there's no money with which to invest on chronic illnesses, in treatment. So the lie is that there's a system that's there to take care of us, but really all it's set to do is prescribe antibiotics, for example. That's cost efficient, or perform surgery in the cases of certain illnesses, or joint replacements, that sort of thing. Is it really there for the provision of complex care needs and based on its massive hollow out neoliberal? And the answer is no. Okay. So, where and how do disabled people fit into socialized systems of care? Well, they don't. Not very well. At least not when the care model is in the hands of other people. In the chronic health and sickness and illness sense, the system is truly dysfunctional. So, an efficiency-based neoliberal model is at the level of political philosophy, is oriented away from disabled people. Because we are, by definition, inefficient. We require investments in capital that, from the system's perspective, are unlikely to provide a return. I emphasize from the system's perspective. I think it's actually a whole lot more expensive to just pretend that this is true. But from the system's perspective, apparently we cost much and aren't worth investing. So that's one reason why Canada's so-called healthcare system, the mental health one, is so abysmally funded. And I saw that question, I think, in the list that was submitted. There's one reason. Can you really fix it? It's like this attitude. I don't know if you can. Let's not bother with that. It's definitely a reason why ASD and ADHD aren't captured by Medicare. It's the reason why so many pediatric programs terminate upon adulthood, releasing individuals with adequate care, or barely adequate care, in the adult system where it's the survival of the fittest ill person. Other than that. So what can be more efficient than a lie? A lie requires no money, and it's largely lies that the policy neoliberalism. One just needs to make the public believe there's a system and it's there for them, and it's not as bad as the American boogeyman. That we have something. And it is the supply of that something that the lie is substantiated. You see the doctors, you see the nurses, and the hospitals, the fact of them, but fall ill and see what the system offers. See if you are satisfied. See if you can rationalize that rationed care. Or see that I'm coming up against my time, so I'm going to accelerate so I can answer a few questions. Strap in. Why is the unwritten policy? What is the unwritten policy, and how does it exist? Well, this is the key explanation as to why things are so static. And you'll see this happen over and over again, every day in the media. The unwritten policy that I refer to is so toxic, I get angry. You can tell from my face thinking about it, because it's an impediment to real change. The unwritten policy is so toxic, we justify COVID lockdowns because we've underfunded the system to such an extreme extent that we have an adequate number of ICU beds for the populace. We have no surge capacity, we're running things according to lean management principles. The unwritten policy is so toxic, I can relate the history of my son to otherwise intelligent, caring people, and they can tell me, with utter sanctimony, of how my view of American care is simplistic. People can lecture me about the outcomes of my family, which were dire, in the name of Canadian goodness and Medicare. Even though America was there for my son, Canada wasn't. Even though I'm a physician and I see how the lie works every day. The unwritten policy, why is this guy so elliptical? Well, apologies. It's this. Anyone who advocates for change in the healthcare system is a conservative monster who wishes to destroy Canadian healthcare. Anyone who defends Canadian healthcare from such monsters does the high holy work of goodness. So the episodes of that unwritten policy are endless, and we see them play out in every election cycle. Policy differences on healthcare are demonized in this exact way. The result is the status quo, and further thinning of a thoroughly neoliberalized system that relies upon further neoliberalization in order to meet its impossible tasks. It's as if the system has been tasked with its own extinction in order to preserve the lie that we need to sleep at night. So why is that policy bad for people like me? And physically disabled people, whatever kind of disabled people, however you want to carve up the term. But that category of people, well, the consequences are obvious. We're the first written out and off. We're the most expensive to care for, according to them. We don't fit into curative models, but we also suffer when such thinking applies to us. The system needs to change for most of us, but we're also the special reason it doesn't change. We cost too much money. So enter the lie. How the American system is bad. It is the boogeyman. Enter the third rail of Canadian politics and how any significant change to Canadian health policy and care delivery is tantamount to importing an American-style health care to Canadians. When really all I hear, me, just little me from around New Brunswick, is disabled lives suck and cost too much, and we prefer the lie to the truth, which is we need to talk honestly about the care systems we have and declare what care systems we need, and decide how we did once upon a time. Remember the horizon there? We need to decide how we did once upon a time, how to get there, and how to bring the horizon back. End.
I'll applaud. I'm the only one here, but I'll applaud. That was amazing. And
I'll clap for myself.
Right? Thank you. You should. And the cats are also clapping for you. They came to hear it. They're here for the lecture. They showed up.
Four strong.
Exactly. For students in the class, I did take live notes of what happened here, and we've been doing some note-taking exercises in this class, and we haven't done a live exercise yet. I will post that for you in the Discord, so you see what that looks like in a live setting. The first thing I want to do, and this is important to me, and probably important to Shane, is take a moment to sit there in a minute of reflection and just think about how we honor and share gratitude when people share their lived experience for our education, right? So I think this is important in text too. And when I'm writing articles, I'll give a section after somebody shares something in poetry to say, this was really hard. And I want you to sit with this before we keep going and lecturing about it and think about the ways in which that might have been hard for the speaker or the sharer and the writer. And in thinking about it, we're practicing gratitude for the things they have to say. So thank you, Shane. And we're having that moment to just think about and reflect on the ways in which the things he talks about and says and experiences and researches are a gift from his life to our lives, right? So that's really important. And I want you to think about that beyond just the lived context and think about how you can be incorporating that in your written works or your write spaces or your exam piece, or if you're going out and talking to other activists. That would be really great. So that's my piece from me. And then, because I had the benefit of actually listening to this talk in real time, I'm going to draw a couple connections for you, because it seems like Shane has seen all the lectures, even though he hasn't, because he did a really fabulous job of hitting most of them. And when you were listening to it, you'll recall bits and pieces from the lectures we already did, right? So he talks about the Hall report. We did that in the Advanced Madness lecture. Remember the one from the UK? He does the diagnostic machine and medicalization. That was from the lecture right before Reading Week. That was in Intro Madness, and it was in the Medicalization of Health lecture. He goes into the USA Medicare brokenness. We did a whole lecture on all the ways in which that doesn't work. He did, oh my gosh, he did too much. He did way too much. And he did the ways in which we honor and speak about how our lived experiences go into systemic change, which has been a theme for all the lectures before Reading Week, especially the ones where we were talking about other people's lived experiences in text, which was really awesome. So thank you for doing an entire course overview in your free time. That was pretty cool. Saved me work because now I don't have to do it. Thanks, Shay. That was awesome. If I could pose to you one or two questions and from what I heard, and then we'll jump to the student questions because it has a little more context. I noticed, and I'm sure you did this on purpose, that you used bad personally, and then you reconstructed bad into a fully structural context. And do you think the reason for that is that both of those root from the word efficiency, or did you do it for another reason?
probably because I've got such an allergy to the word. So no, I cannot claim a overarching intelligent reason other than to say that I deliberately try to troll that word whenever I find it, because I find that a rush to simple, moralistic judgment results in such pathologization of people like myself, especially coders to us. It sticks to us.
Yeah.
You know, so when I hear that word, I immediately want to rush against it and try and reclaim it as good.
Try and reclaim it. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot of that's interesting because Aaron also talks about reclamation politics, right? And that gets really dicey in the madness context, right? Because what do we want to reclaim and what do we want to leave behind?
I'm going to say self-reclamation as what I can define as good for me, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel like having to convince the normie that what they're doing is bad, or that their concepts around the words are bad. I mean, it might not exactly translate. I guess it really, when I think about it, it really goes back to being like when one is facing one's greatest amount of development, like in year 2 or year 3 or year 4, and how powerfully stigmatizing, shame-inducing that word is. And so I hear it, and I'm reverted back to 2 or 3 or 4 years old, and I'm like, no. Having my little tantrum about the word, not bad, not bad. And so I'm just kind of rampaging as an academic around the word bad.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm going to switch to a couple student questions with our last couple minutes. Someone, a beloved community member from our classroom community, said, the quote you highlighted through your writing, quote, "You weep for your love, I for my limbs. Who mourns with reason? Who overwhelms?" End quote. What exactly is your interpretation of this quote? So maybe from like a hindsight perspective at this point.
Yeah, that's a quote. The poet's name doesn't immediately leap to mind, unfortunately. I apologize, I'm drawing a blank on that. But a very famous American poet who's prominent in the disability poetics movement. So, God, it's a shape I can't remember. Anyway, they were physically disabled. I think it was CP, or it was CP, not MS and CP. But anyway, there was a equivalency being made that I thought was beautiful. I think that we can just draw distinctions from one another, and I think those distinctions are righteous, and we shouldn't preclude similarities of experience upon our identities. But I find in that poem some sort of alchemical crucible, or just some sort of way that we can say, we're different, but in this difference there are samenesses, and in these samenesses there are differences. There's this, again, this troubling kind of maelstrom to say, I'm physically disabled, but who is to say that this is greater a disability in this physical, clearly manifest, visible disability? How can I say that this is greater or more meaningful or more substantial than some mental distress that you may experience?
Right.
That's my answer.
I mean, that was pretty beautifully said. We could have just ended it right there. You just solved a lot of medicalization philosophy. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. It was wonderful. You can pass on this one, but I thought this was a really interesting question. How has your personal lived experience with bipolar disorder helped you inspire others around you? So without going into the overcoming rhetoric, when it comes to activism and the awareness around the ways in which this activism is needed.
Okay, so there's a couple of threads there. The first thread is there's a benefit. I immediately want to go away on tangents and answer the question. There are no followers of shame. Say that at the start. There's no followers out there that I'm aware of that are quoting me or invoking me or reaching out to me saying, you know, you're real inspiration, unless I'm in their space. And then every once in a while someone will come up to me and say something. But there's no digital contact. And that's largely owing to my lack of social reciprocity. I deliberately, or I implicitly, live a life in which it's kind of hard just to walk up and say hi.
Yeah.
You know, because I'm kind of grim outside of the screen. So there's nobody like that. But however, there's been lots of magazine pieces and things like that saying, "Yay, you're doing this, and that's so great." So apparently, it is having a work in the world, but I don't see it manifesting virally, you know, out there as other people are doing things. However, the more spaces I go and the more things I do, especially in medical ones, which is my favorite place to go. I was just in McGill last week doing a poetry workshop out there in the Mod Abbott Medical Museum. My favorite thing to do is to be strange in those spaces because it was so pathologized before. It was so uncomfortable. So going there is a way to get, you know, my own back in a sense, but also to spread this alternative gospel and practice medicine by other means in those places. And to say, you know, there's this different way of being that isn't necessarily biomedical. Let's do this. And, you know, my biography and my own self and my own affect can't help but leak out all the time. You know, it's obvious that I'm not, based on some tips and things, I'm not like everybody else. So it just is there, you know, and it's welcome. It's the thing that's doing the talk. It's the thing that's doing the workshop. And it's friendly because it really wants to spread poetry around.
Yeah.
I like to think that thing's having an effect because people seem to like that. When it comes to, what was the other part of that question? The second part?
Activism and awareness for how the system doesn't work for mental health. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always difficult. What I tell people in the medical field in that regard, when I occasionally have more personal-oriented discussions around lived experience, which are infrequent but do happen, is I tell them that it has to hurt. I don't know if that makes sense to you. But I have often seen the vaunted warrior who is profiting from their tales of woe and is getting, and maybe that's inappropriate for me to say, but I watch the vended tales of difficulty and I think there's something not square here. Like, it always hurts me to go back to these things. It always kind of discomfits me. Like, the treatment is never going to suddenly be rehabilitated. It was just too difficult. And if I'm listening and I'm not getting that sense of authenticity, I worry and I fret. So there always has to be, for me, some sort of inner difficulty that I'm confronting each time I have these talks. Otherwise, I'm doing it for a professional reason, and that discomforts me really severely. So if in a weird way, I know that if I'm somewhat triggered by it, like a little bit, then I'm probably spiritually in the right place for it. So that's what I tell other people to do, if that's an answer.
That's a really good answer. Like, I like how you phrased it too, like being strange in space as activism, because then it's kind of a rhetorical looping of the affective experience of being around you becomes the activist element, right? I think a lot of mad people or people in Mad Gang would agree with that. I think that's a really good answer, obviously. And I'll add, I was Team Shane before it was apparently cool. I really did feel inspired by the Burnout article. I finished reading that and I was like, God damn it. That was really good. That was good literature. And I didn't assign that one to you guys because it's in the world's most expensive medical book. That's not true. There's probably more expensive medical texts, but in medical humanities, goddamn, that book is expensive. So I can't.
It's pricey.
Yeah. That's the worst part about it.
You're unusual though, sir. I don't really get too many people reaching out to me on DMs on Twitter with purple hearts, and it's that thing that I'm not being knocking you because you asked, how do we actually sit back and appreciate lived experience? Well, for a character like myself, you've got to kind of be very welcoming. Otherwise, I'll be over here and I won't come.
Yeah.
I'll be hiding in the corner,
Are you perhaps signaling to, listen up students, the warmth of beloved community and how community-oriented actions can bring knowledge and experience together?
Sarah embodies that times a billion.
Incroyable. I did not tell him to say that. And I don't, but I appreciate that you tried. That's lovely. That's really nice of you. we are coming up at the end of our time. I would like, on behalf of all of you listening to the recording, to thank the illustrious Dr. Shane Neilson for being here, for giving a wonderful lecture, for giving us wonderful ways into MAD or CDS gang activism for you to think about, and your reflection exercise for that is going to be on the last part. So reflecting on how this information leads to an activist space, okay? And that will be in your Discord. So thank you, and I wish you a good week.